Welcome to our webinar today. We're very glad you could join us. We still have a number of people joining, so we're going to wait one more minute before we get going. All right, we will go ahead and start, even though it looks like a few more people are still joining us. So hello, welcome again. My name is Christina Majorkert, and on behalf of the Secretariat of the Architecture for REDD+ Transactions, or ART, I would like to thank all of you for attending our webinar today. We're very excited to see so many people joining. Before we start, I just would like to cover some basic webinar logistics. We will answer questions at the end of the session after the presentation is fully completed. However, you are welcome to submit questions at any time by using the chat feature at the bottom of the webinar screen. Please type in your question and submit it. I would like to note that the webinar is being recorded and we will post it on the ART website shortly. Pernilla Holtendahl and I are pleased to be your presenters today, and we look forward to sharing information based on the paper we authored along with Timothy Pearson entitled Private Sector Involvement in REDD+ under ART. With that, I will now turn the microphone over to Pernilla to kick us off.
Great, thank you very much, Christy. Hello everyone and a warm welcome. As Christy said, my name is Pernilla Holtendahl and I'll be taking you through the first slides of this presentation. I'm sure you agree that the past 2 years have been incredibly challenging for the global economy and in particular for the people of countries that have suffered because of the COVID pandemic. But in addition to being a period dominated by the pandemic, it has also been a period of renewed commitments to stopping climate change and to forest conservation in particular. COP26 was the latest expression of this. There were several agreements that were reached and progress was made. Natural climate solutions are critical to combating climate change. Scenarios which evaluate pathways to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by mid-century conclude that natural climate solutions, and in particular the protection and restoration of forests, are critical to deliver near-term low-cost climate benefits at scale. The delivery of natural climate solutions will require effort and ambition on scales that we have not seen before. And just to illustrate the sheer scale of these needs, the Green Gigaton Challenge has suggested that we should target at least 1 million jurisdictional REDD+ emission reductions per year by 2025. So what does this mean, or this need for scale, what does it mean? As governments set ever more ambitious targets, how can they meet these goals most effectively? A key factor in achieving sustainable, significant emission reductions is a well-planned and comprehensive REDD+ strategy. REDD+ strategies must include all stakeholders, including the private sector. And we should point out that we define private sector broadly. It's not just project companies or those who buy credits. It involves companies who have an impact on forests, those who live and produce in them sustainably, for instance, ecotourism operators. It includes indigenous peoples, local community organizations. All of these groups should be brought in to contribute and to collaborate. Active collaboration will improve the chances of success and long-term sustainability of efforts. I'm sure we've all experienced that there are positive feedback loops between participating and a sense of ownership and performance. Collaboration or private sector collaboration has historically focused on REDD+ projects, but a range of models exist. And what you see in front of you now is the range of models that we would like to present to you today. We've presented it as a fan of options. As I mentioned earlier, the private sector covers many types of companies, and that means necessarily that there are many different kinds of roles that a private sector company can play. For instance, all the way to the left, you see the private sector as investors. All the way to the right on the fan, you see project developers. And there's a range in between of types of companies. At the bottom of this fan is the government. That's the foundation as we see it for this model. The government is steering the country, or that's our assumption, steering the country in the best possible direction for the benefit of the people of the country and for climate change. The purpose of our paper is to offer options for the roles that the private sector can play in supporting government objectives in the forest sector. It should be seen as a guide for governments participating in art on how to bring in greater collaboration with the private sector. It is expected that governments will utilize a combination of approaches. We wrote this paper because, in our experience, the range of possible private investors' involvement in REDD+ programs is generally not well understood. Typically, there's a binary focus either on the great benefits or the catastrophic risks of private sector participation in REDD+. And with this paper, we hope to, in the presentation today, we hope to offer some clarity and nuance to this discussion and to put such binary discussions to rest. We will now go through the models, and for each we will briefly discuss how the model can be integrated with participation in art. For those of you that are not familiar with ARD, it is a global voluntary carbon program architecture to register, verify, and issue high-quality REDD+ emission reduction credits to countries and jurisdictions. I should also mention upfront that each government must consider current laws, regulation, and NDC commitments and how these may impact the choice of options. They should take also into account the issue of carbon rights, which is not something we will discuss further in this webinar, but the paper has a short discussion on it and there is a growing literature on the topic. So let's turn to Model 1, the foundation. Model 1 is a traditional conservation model whereby governments create and maintain conservation areas, national parks or other protected areas, and they regulate land use. The protected areas are typically managed by a government agency or by indigenous peoples or local communities, but they're funded by the government. This is a traditional approach to conservation as we've known it over the past century or so in, for instance, North America, Europe, and increasingly globally. It can be a successful model, but we often see that enforcement is very difficult, it's challenging, partly because of a lack of resources, so lack of funding, of people, of money to ensure that forests are protected. And particularly, this made particularly acute, this challenge in tropical forest countries where the alternative land use value is high, for instance, the value of developing commodities production. So we then propose to, as we call it, turn the dial. Given this foundation of a government-led model, how can we start introducing the private sector? Model 1 is a useful starting point, but we are unlikely to be able to generate the scale of protection that we need. A natural first step to introduce the private sector, perhaps, is to bring them in as funders and investors. The benefit of this is that the government gets access to capital, which will increase investments and increase the likelihood and successful protection and restoration of forests. So let's then go into some details on Model 2. In Model 2, the government continues to manage and implement all REDD+ activities, but the private sector provides the funding for it. In Model 2A, we have 3 models. The national government or a jurisdiction, subnational jurisdiction, will design and implement the REDD+ program and will sell credits that are generated to private companies. This is perhaps the most hands-off model. Later on in the presentation, we will cover models where the private sector plays a much more active role in the development of credits or projects. Governments are likely to find that some private companies are very happy to buy purchase credits once they've been verified as a model 2A, whilst others may insist on or prefer to be involved in the developments, and we will talk about that type of model later on. The problem with the challenge with model 2A is that governments only receive payments once the reductions have been issued and the credits. And this is a process which can take several years. This means that governments often suffer from an upfront funding gap. Hence, we introduce models 2B and 2C, which are models where there is the funding is provided upfront. In model 2B, the government creates a REDD+ company. The company can be a state enterprise, a joint venture, a special purpose vehicle. It would be governed in the national interest, but it would be backed by private investors. Private investors could provide equity or debt to the company, and in return, they would receive dividends or other types of returns on their investment. Alternatively, the government can issue bonds, and then they limit the use of proceeds from that bond to REDD+ activities. This is another way of tapping international capital markets. And again, it would provide government with funding upfront. Different versions of Model C exist already and are covered in some more detail in the paper. Model 2 has the potential to be integrated under ARCH. If the government chooses one of those models and implements protection and conservation measures, these are likely to lead to emission reductions at the jurisdiction level. For Model 2A, these are directly linked. So the issuance of 3 credits under ARCH will be received. So the revenues from that can go straight to the government, either through the sale of credits or possibly payment for a performance approach. In models 2B and 2C, the emission reductions that are generated go to governments first, and then they in turn pay the investors in the bond or in the REDD+ company. And the way they pay will have been agreed upon upfront before the investment is made. The options that we have just gone through very briefly, and there's more detail in the paper on 2A, 2B, and C, they're innovative and can be effective ways of mobilizing international capital, but they do not change the behavior of private businesses in forest countries on the ground. So we're now turning our attention to these. How can actors, private sector companies in forest countries be effectively engaged in national conservation efforts? And for that to happen, we will see that national regulations and incentives are a good place to start. So we've now come to Model 3. Model 3, or let's just start by actually reinforcing this point that governments typically find that creating national parks and protected areas, the sort of activities they do in Model 1 and 2, the government-led models, is not enough. Deforestation often occurs on privately owned land, so regulation needs to be extended. It can be regulation that's extended, or it can be through also incentives. For instance, and there are many examples of this already, the Brazil Forest Code with forest set-asides, for instance, there's a mandate in Gabon on FSC certification of forest concessions. So these are examples of regulations or mandates. Then you also have banks, for instance, can offer incentives, subsidized credit lines. These are ways of using subsidized credit to incentivize farmers to undertake more sustainable production methods. And these all together, a variety of tools can then be used to extend government control over deforestation outcomes on privately owned land. And the result of that, if it works out, is that there will be improved forest cover, reduced deforestation, and degradation. And Model 3 can be integrated with art. So on to the next slide. Governments can monitor the emission reductions and removals that are achieved as a result of these policies. So they monitor those at the jurisdiction level. These can then be transformed into REDD+ credits or payment for performance revenues through art. Reductions and removals, payments can then be applied to cover the costs of incentives, so help the government fund these incentives, or enforcement efforts, or to fund new activities. It's clear that regulations and incentives have a clear role to play in an economy. Most countries have some types of regulation already. But again, this is not a solution that can fix one solution that can fix all problems. There are challenges such as ineffective enforcement or the lack of uptake, for instance, that the credit lines exist, but people just don't make use of them. All that means together that outcomes are not guaranteed. So there are shortcomings to these tools as well. And then there are also a number of players on the ground that are not reached by these types of tools. So farmers and landowners, for instance, are one type of private sector players, but they're only one piece in the puzzle. So the next question is, how can one extend the reach and reach more companies, for instance, further up the supply chain, in order to increase REDD+ success for countries? So I will turn over to you now, Christy.
Thanks so much. So yes, so I will pick up there and start with Model 4. So as Pernilla indicated, commodity traders and consumer good manufacturers have taken on increasingly significant commitments to eradicate deforestation from their supply chains. In Model 4, the private sector implements measures to reduce emissions in its own supply chain, but does not sell offsets or expect a return on investment, even though the investments might be profitable. However, the company may quantify and even possibly verify the reduction in emissions and compare them against overall corporate emissions. This practice is commonly referred to as carbon insetting. All of these activities and the commitment to do even more present a unique opportunity for governments to engage with the private sector, to better coordinate activities across the private and public sectors, and for the government to provide comprehensive monitoring and reporting, which will improve the transparency and credibility of this model. We will discuss that a little bit more on the next slide. Because all of these actions are voluntary, the option can easily be undertaken without needing to wait for market or regulatory signals, which makes it even more attractive. So to date, supply chain initiatives have often either not conducted monitoring and reporting of their greenhouse gas benefits, or have done so without verification. As a result, companies have often failed to demonstrate verifiable results from their activities, which undermines their credibility. Under ART, however, governments would monitor and report the greenhouse gas results across the entire jurisdiction, as well as the social and environmental benefits and safeguards associated with the activities. This helps everybody. Companies will have greater evidence that the actions undertaken have led to meaningful change and that they were conducted with comprehensive environmental, social, and governance safeguards. Governments have the opportunity to help integrate actions across companies and integrate them with government initiatives, thereby being more efficient and having more effective emission reductions and removals. Some of the revenue from the jurisdictional level emission reductions and removals could be put towards encouraging collaboration platforms among corporates to further improve supply chain reductions, or even shared with the private sector in some form of revenue sharing model. So as it's hopefully obvious, improving the performance of supply chains is very important to reducing emissions, and consumer-facing companies have an extremely important role to play in driving change. But what about areas of forest that are not suitable for or involved in the production of commodities? How do we engage those areas, and what types of private sector partners might we find there? That takes us to our next model. So as you likely know, vast areas of forest landscapes are inhabited by local communities who impact the forest both positively and negatively. Engaging these communities in productive and sustainable economic activities that reduce pressure on forests can be key to protecting landscapes and to creating employment opportunities. In Model 5, the private sector invests in forest-related industries or activities which lead to forest protection and provide alternatives to activities that cause deforestation. However, their revenues come from the sale of commercial products or services and do not depend on revenues from carbon credits. Governments can encourage this model through regulation and incentives, such as providing production licenses to local enterprises, requiring sustainable forest management practices, or even giving preferential funding or other incentives to attract commercial interests. Sustainable forest enterprises implemented by the private sector or local communities are likely to result in emission reductions and removals that can be captured under ART by governments at the jurisdictional level. Governments have a role in promoting and attracting forest enterprises and can use some of the revenues from the sale of carbon to build infrastructure or otherwise support the forest communities and their private sector partners. In many cases, though, forest enterprises do not generate sufficient revenues to provide viable livelihoods for the local population or to attract commercially minded investors. The challenges related to the commercial success and financial sustainability of forest enterprises have been noted in several studies. In those cases, revenues from carbon would be a welcome supplement, and inviting enterprises to develop such projects represents a way of further turning the dial on private sector participation. Which leads us to Model 6. The model described in number 5 has a lot of positive features, but as I mentioned, a recurring challenge is the need to obtain sufficient funding for forest conservation practices, which only rely on local forest products or other small-scale activities. In those cases, additional revenue from carbon can play a key role in keeping trees standing. In Model 6, the private sector, again, reminder, defined here inclusively as international entities, local enterprises, indigenous peoples, or communities, assist the government in achieving emissions reductions and removals by helping to implement REDD+ activities. In turn, they are compensated based on implementation goals, emission reductions or removals, or ecosystem services created. This model has traditionally relied on a payment for performance or payment for practice system, where the private sector has little or no autonomy in designing the programs, but it can be easily expanded to include private sector-led programs as well. For the governments, a benefit of the practice and performance-based system is that it avoids the inherent challenges related to nesting private projects within a national REDD+ strategy. From the private sector perspective, practice and performance-based payments may be an attractive way to engage in carbon-generating activities with relatively secure income flows, albeit without the opportunity of participating directly in the sale of carbon credits. So integrating Model 6 under an ART program, the government would monitor and capture the reductions and removals achieved by all of these efforts as part of its accounting under ART, and it would receive funding through the sale of credits or payments for performance. These revenues could be used to pay private sector entities and forest communities based on the reductions achieved. The carbon benefits of the implemented forest enterprise activities could be quantified and rewarded using a simplified accounting method to reduce the burden on the private sector, or they could use implementation goals or other metrics to define payment. The government may, because of a lack of capacity or funding, decide that it would like to turn the dial even further and open the market up for generating carbon credits from projects to private developers directly. For that, we turn to Model 7, which is our last set of models. In this set, the private sector develops forest carbon projects and receives a direct return on investment from offset revenues. A key feature of jurisdictional REDD+ is the ability to integrate smaller scale activities into the overarching strategy and accounting. There are many ways to accomplish the integration, and governments and project developers have the opportunity to select the model or models that is best for mutual success. It may even be determined that multiple approaches are best. For example, maybe one approach is used for legacy projects that are continuing to support national ambition, and a different approach is selected for new projects. I'll present an overview of 7A, 7B, and 7C, but there is much greater detail on each of these models along with thoughts for consideration for each in the paper. So I'd encourage you to review the paper for additional information. In Model 7A, the first version, offsets are sold domestically, with the government potentially creating a demand for offsets and overseeing the administration of offset supply. The demand for offsets could be created via a compliance mechanism, such as a cap and trade system or a taxation system, or even from voluntary demand. A key advantage of selling into a domestic offset system is that it avoids the need for international transfers of credits and removes the risk of double counting. Models 7B and 7C are the options that most people think of when private sector investment or nesting in REDD+ is discussed. Private developers may invest funds and oversee the identification of opportunities, as well as the design and implementation of the carbon project. In Models 7B and 7C, it is assumed that the project's baseline would have to fit within the government's crediting level, or to be nested, and the project would receive either carbon credits or carbon revenues in return for their successful efforts. Applying the jurisdictional crediting level to the project avoids the instance where a project using a non-nested baseline generates a disproportionate quantity of credits. So how can these models be integrated under ART? So countries or jurisdictions participating in ART can, and most likely will, integrate projects into their REDD+ strategy. There are multiple pathways possible for project nesting under ART. And as I mentioned, different pathways could be selected for different projects, especially for existing projects and future projects. So the first pathway I'd like to touch on is a fully nested project where only trees credits are issued. In this pathway, the government has an agreement with the project developer, and the project is not registered with any other greenhouse gas program. The terms of this agreement are left to the government and project developer to negotiate, but must be negotiated in line with the tree safeguards and ownership requirements. ART only issues credits to governments, so following successful verification of emission reductions and removals, the government would either transfer a portion of the tree's credits to the project developer, or would share a portion of the carbon revenue with the project developer. If trees credits are transferred to the project developer, the developer then is free to negotiate and transact the sale of credits on its own, which is likely to be attractive to many developers. The key question we get is how to allocate the number of credits or the revenues to a project. There are numerous credible ways to conduct this allocation, and all are permissible under ART. This flexibility provides opportunities for governments to build on existing efforts rather than enforcing a one-size-fits-all requirement. Several allocation systems already exist in the market that could be used as examples. So a spatial or risk allocation could be utilized to assign portions of the crediting level to specific areas based on localized deforestation risks. Or a scoring system could be used based on selected characteristics of the programs, such as area of forest, ecosystem services provided, biodiversity, cultural significance, or any other factor. ART accepts all allocation systems as long as there is verifiable evidence of agreement by all stakeholders in line with the tree safeguards. Another pathway is that the project is fully nested, but project credits are issued under a different greenhouse gas program. So in this pathway, the tree's crediting level is applied as the baseline for the project level accounting. The project would register the credits under a greenhouse gas program outside of ART. In this instance, the government would need to subtract the volume of credits issued under the other greenhouse gas program from its claimed trees credits in line with the double counting provisions of trees. A third pathway is that the project isn't nested at all. So a government participating in ART could also choose to allow projects to quantify and issue credits under a different greenhouse gas program using a different baseline or crediting level. As in Pathway 2, the volume of credits issued from the project would need to be subtracted from the trees credits issued to the government for that same year. Without the alignment of the crediting level, however, a significant risk does exist that the government will receive few or no trees credits. So one important item to note, all of these options assume that the project developer with the rights to the carbon, whether a company, local community, indigenous peoples group, or others, actually wishes to enter into an agreement with the government. Our Nesting Under Art paper on the ART website addresses this topic more fully, including the scenarios where the project developer does not wish to enter into an agreement with the government, which is also possible. So today we've presented many different options for private sector involvement in the forest sector, which vary greatly in nature and intensity. Many of these models can and indeed should coexist. As we stated at the beginning, the starting point for most countries is going to be a set of government-led conservation efforts. From this foundation, elements of private sector involvement can be introduced, and then with each turning of the dial, as we're calling it, governments will have an opportunity to engage more deeply with the private sector, not just by raising capital, but by incentivizing behavior and ultimately inviting the participation of carbon project developers. Fundamentally, a government wants to find the combination of policies which best enlists the support of all the actors to most successfully reduce emissions. As I hope you can see, all of these options can be integrated under ART programs successfully. All of the models result in emission reductions and removals, which can be accommodated within a national or jurisdictional accounting system. For many models, this will be a straightforward affair using a simplified crediting and compensation system. But even if independent projects are permitted, a nesting methodology can also be applied, and this can work quite nicely within the system as well. All right, with that, that concludes our formal presentation. I'd like to thank you again for joining our webinar today. We hope you have found the presentation informative. We are now going to respond to some of the questions that have come in during the presentation. Thank you for your engagement. If we do not have a chance to address your questions live, we will definitely follow up with you after the webinar. And just a friendly reminder, a recording of this webinar will be available on the ART website soon. All right, Pernilla, I know you've been able to monitor the questions, so I might have you kick us off.
Yes, sure. I guess I just wanted to underline a couple of things as you were wrapping up, Christy, and that's we think it's, you know, when governments think about how to best engage with the private sector, a couple of caveats of them maybe we should keep in mind. One of them is we've called all private sector appetite is not created equal. So although we present a fan of options, that fan of options may not be the same for all countries. It's not given that the private sector is interested in a particular way of cooperating. So obviously, there is going to be an engagement going on between the government and the various private sector participants. Likewise, governments should have realistic expectations. There might be a huge ecosystem of potential private sector actors who want to be involved, and others, other countries may struggle. So a solid REDD+ strategy should take all the local context into account. I just wanted to add that, and then I see there's a question that has come in. The question is, what's the difference between Model 6 and the model in 7? That's a very good question. In both Model 6 and 7, the private sector entity invests in and implement the REDD+ activities, and these activities will contribute to emission reductions. However, in Model 6, the project is not monitored and reported on at the project level, but it is in Model 7. So in Model 6, the emission reductions are only monitored as part of the jurisdictional program, and revenues are then shared based on the terms of the agreements that were reached beforehand. And the sharing of revenues could be based on a simplified carbon accounting system to reduce MRV burden on the project developer, or you could use metrics that have been agreed on beforehand by the parties. On the other hand, in Model 7, the project is monitored both at the project scale and as part of the overall jurisdiction. And this requires additional efforts regarding MRV, but allows the emission reductions from the project to be quantified. I hope that sort of is an okay answer to the question, and if not, there are more details in the paper. Let's see what other questions have come in. One says, well, what is the level of risk to private investors in REDD+ projects posed by legislative and regulatory changes? Well, that's a very good question. Obviously, there will always be risks involved in this. Probably the best recommendation we would have is to do as much due diligence as possible and create sort of long-term and long-standing collaboration agreements and dialogue between the companies and the government. So that kind of long-standing relationship will lessen the elements of surprise possibly. Although of course there's no way of guaranteeing against these changes. So it's definitely part of the risk picture. I also see that there's a question on communal lands. I'm not sure, Christy, or do you want to take that question?
Yeah,
or
I can take that one, sure. Yeah, so I think that the simple answer would be that as mentioned, art does not directly credit to private sector entities. So there would not be an opportunity for communal lands to become an art participant directly. However, as I hope we have shown throughout the entire presentation, there are numerous ways that we can envision that the private sector can engage with the government and support the national ambition and support the generation of credits, and a lot of different models that communal lands or community organizations or indigenous peoples territories could engage with the government through a variety of models and have agreements to receive benefits that way. Just scanning the question. So that actually sort of dovetails to, we had a question about how would we suggest private sector entities who want to engage with governments participating in art go about that. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of different options that we can envision for how private sector entities could interact with and support national emission reduction and removal efforts. As Pernilla mentioned, not all options are going to be equally attractive or applicable to all private sector entities though. So we realize that there are different models that will appeal to different groups. My suggestion would be, if you have a current practice or you fall under one of these models, or there's a model that would really appeal to you as a private sector entity, then as Pernilla suggested, the relationship is important, and you could certainly reach out to government representatives to offer support and start the discussions on what that might look like. Let's see, what other questions do we have? So another one that came in is, could you provide an example of how these models might actually be used together by a government? So sure, that's an interesting example or interesting question. So one possibility would be a government could simultaneously work with companies who want to buy offset credits generated by the government under art. So that would be, I think it's model 2A. One of the early models. They could also work with a group of investors who wanted to purchase bonds, say, to finance REDD+ activities. That's another model 2 option. Perhaps they're also at the same time working with firms that are investing in their supply chain for cocoa production in the country. And the government wants to coordinate the efforts across the companies that are investing in it and across the different organizations working on the supply chain deforestation efforts. And maybe at the same time, they're working with a coalition of local communities and indigenous peoples who want to establish an ecotourism business in their lands, for example. And then maybe at the same time, they're working with REDD+ project developers that have been working in the country for a decade to identify how the projects could share lessons learned and continue helping reduce emissions moving forward. So those would be examples of a bunch of different models all put together that really engage different stakeholders, and you could really mix and match them however you wanted, or in whatever way there is interest both from the government and from the private sector entities. You know, as integrated under art, basically the impacts of all these activities would be captured along with the social and environmental safeguards as part of the monitoring and verification. So you would be able to see quite transparently what the impact of the combined efforts of all these different activities. And actually, in thinking through this, so this is a perfect example of why TREES does not require a single national benefit sharing program. TREES requires that agreements are made with appropriate stakeholders at the relevant levels. And the idea is to ensure that the agreements are appropriate to the nature of the activities and include all the right stakeholders for that particular agreement. As we just listed, that was a wide variety of different types of activities, each that have their own stakeholders, and necessarily it makes sense to each have its own benefit sharing agreement and have terms that are individually matched to what those stakeholders need and want and what those types of activities are. And of course, all of that would have to be done within our safeguards requirements to ensure, you know, proper participation and transparency, and then that the agreements are actually adhered to. So those would be important to note as well.
Okay, I can see, Christy, I see a question here on
okay.
Model 3.
Oh, great.
I think there's a question saying, could you provide some examples of incentives? So if you recall, Model 3 is the model where it's one of the early models again, and it's about how the government can regulate or incentivize companies to reduce deforestation on private lands. Incentives can include tax breaks, for instance, can be reduction in fees or in interest rates, subsidies. Incentives can be applied in addition to regulation. It's not sort of one or the other, but you can have sort of sweetening of pills, for instance. So you have some kind of regulation, but there's an incentive on top of it. For example, one example from the United States, which has been for a long time, is the tradition of conservation easements. So conservation easements are commitments to uphold certain environmental benefits in perpetuity, which becomes part of the property's deed. The incentive, the reason why landowners are happy to do that is that they receive tax benefits for this, so that the tax benefits then becomes an income stream for them. And then we also mentioned earlier, I think it's important to remember that there are third parties here, like the financial sector is important as a provider of credits. It could be credit enhancements or reduction in interest rates, for instance, for sustainable capital practices, etc. In Brazil, for instance, the ABC program has been around for a while and offers lines of credit to farmers who adopt less greenhouse gas intensive practices. It's been in place since 2010. So there are quite a lot of examples out there and lots to be done.
Thanks, Pernilla. I think that covers all of the questions that have come in. So with that, I'll conclude this webinar. Please feel free, however, the red@winrock.org email is a great way to contact us if you think of any other questions following this, the conclusion of the webinar. But once again, I would just like to thank you for taking the time to join us today, and we hope that the paper spurs some interesting and fruitful discussions and thoughts. So we look forward to continued discussions on this topic. Have a wonderful day.